One of the lovely things about the mystery quilt is that everything has been cut accurately for you. But you might not have made such a detailed quilt before, and you might be wondering about your 1/4 inch seams. Am I going to manage it? Well, yes, you are, and I'm going to show you how. What you're going to do first of all is to get your machine set up so that you know how to sew your 1/4 inch seam so that it comes out right. Now, when I design patterns, when any pattern designer designs patterns, if they want, say, this width here to be 2 inches, they will cut that at 2.5. So that means you've got 1/2 inch for the seams, 1/4 inch on this side and 1/4 inch on this side. Now, of course, we're dealing with a physical product here, fabric, and when you fold it and press it, you lose 1 or 2 threads in that seam. So if you measure your seam and it's exactly 1/4 inch, but the centre isn't measuring the 2 inches, you may be wondering why, and that's the reason. It's because a couple of threads, 1 or 2 threads, gets taken up in the seam. And so although we talk about a 1/4 inch seam, we always mean a scant 1/4 inch seam. Scant being slightly less than. So to check your machine is set up to do that, you're going to get yourself some scrap fabric and cut 2.5 inch strips. So I've got a 2.5, I've put the 2.5 inch line of my ruler on here. That's my left-handed way of doing it. If you're right-handed, turn your ruler around, put your 2.5 inch line on the edge of the fabric, not over the edge, on the edge, like that. So the black line should just cover up the edge of the fabric. Then you cut through like this. So I've got 2 strips of this fabric, and I'm going to cut 1 strip of this fabric. So it's just 2 alternate colours of fabric. They can even be the same colour if you want, it's not a problem. Let's cut through there. And I've noticed that I was a bit wonky on my other cut, so I'm going to turn it around, put the 2.5 inches on the edge. Sometimes you have to just pull the fabric into submission. Cut through there. So now I have 3 strips that are exactly 2.5 inches wide. I'm going to cut them down a bit so that I've got a couple of goes at getting my 1/4 inch seam sorted. I'm going to cut them down to about 4 inches. That's plenty. It's not precise, this doesn't have to be precise, this bit. So I've got 2 sets of fabric, and I'm going to now go over to the sewing machine, sew these together, and then measure the centre part. And now we're ready to sew our test piece. Before I start sewing on anything, I've got my little scrap of fabric. I'm just going to put the needle down and just sew onto the edge of my scrap of fabric. So what that does is that stops the machine from trying to grab any points of triangles and sink them down into the bottom. It also acts as a bit of a check to make sure that your machine is threaded properly and sewing nicely. So let's try this test piece. So we've got our 3 pieces that are 2.5 inches wide. First of all, we're going to sew these 2 together. So there's 3 steps to getting your seams correct. The first step is cutting correctly. Well, with the mystery, that's not a problem. The second step is lining your fabric edges up properly. They need to be level with each other all the way along. If I was sewing them with them like that, I've already introduced an error. So always make sure they're lined up, and if you want to, pin everything. I use these really fine pins. I love these. I don't really like bigger pins because they often bend the fabric out of place. Don't run over the pins on your machine though. So I'm not going to pin. but you're welcome to. Then I'm going to place this so that the edge is just almost touching my 1/4 inch seam guide here. And again, all 1/4 inch feet are slightly different, so you just have to practice with yours to see how it's going to work. So that's my first seam. You also want to make sure that your seams are straight all the way down, and it's quite easy to, when you get going, to sew off to one side when you get to the bottom. That's what I call a happy seam. So if you don't have a 1/4 inch foot, how do you make sure that you're getting a 1/4 inch seam? Well, most of the needle plates on the machines come with markings, so you can usually find a place that you can follow. What I've done here is I've used the ruler to measure just under 1/4 inch out from my needle. Then I've put some washi tape on my needle plate to show where to put the fabric. And you can move the washi tape and move the needle until you get it set up the way you want it. Okay, now we've sewn that seam, we're going to sew these two pieces together. Okay, so step 3 of our 4 ways of getting all our seams correct is the pressing. So now I've sewn this, I need to press it. I'm going to get the iron and I'm just going to press like that to sink the stitches in. And then I'm going to open it out, and you'll find in the instructions you get a pressing direction. So I'm pressing towards my green fabric. Now if you notice, I'm not doing this with my iron because that will warp your fabric. I'm just pressing down. Can hold it down, hold it down, hold it down. Then we're going to go to this side. So we're going to press the stitches in, open it out, and press again. Now, one tip for beginners particularly is to make sure that you haven't pressed a pleat in here, because again, if you press a pleat in, your seam is going to be bigger than 1/4 inch, and then your sizes won't work out the way you want them to. So all nicely pressed with no pleats in. So now that we've done the pressing, all we need to do now is to put the ruler on top, put a line on top of this seam and check where this seam comes to. And this seam here is exactly 2 inches across. So with this one, I have perfect 1/4 inch seams, and I know everything's working fine. The way to tell if your seam is too small or too big is by the measurement that you get across here. So when I measure across here, I should get 2 inches, 1, 2. If it's under 2 inches, I know that my seams are very slightly too big. And if it's over 2 inches, my seams are very slightly too small. So I hope that's helped. It's worth practicing with your 1/4 inch seams, but it's not worth stressing about them. So relax, enjoy sewing your mystery quilt, and I hope you have fun, and I look forward to seeing your pictures.